not usually a big ballet fan, but I have been to see the Nutcracker multiple times, the first time as a small child. It's kind of a Christmas tradition with my family. We don't do it every year, but we do it often enough, every few years. So I'm pretty familiar with the story of the Nutcracker. Or so I thought. Then I read the short stories that it was based on, and wow, it's like completely different. So the ballet by Tchaikovsky dates back to the 1890s, but it's based on a short story by Alexander Dumas, which was published in 1844. And that story is actually a retelling of another short story by E.T.A. Hoffmann, which was published in 1816. So this is actually a relatively old story. When I decided to read The Nutcracker, I got this book from Penguin Classics, which includes both versions, the one by Hoffmann and the one by Dumas. I read both of these this month, and I want to talk about the differences and the similarities between them, as well as the differences between the short stories and the ballet. So let's start with the two short stories, The Nutcracker and the Mouse King by E.T.A. Hoffmann and The Tale of the Nutcracker by Alexander Dumas. They're very similar in terms of the content and the events that take place, but they're very different in terms of the tone and the style. Hoffmann's The Nutcracker and the Mouse King reads like an old fairy tale, like something out of the Grimm brothers. Whereas Dumas's The Tale of the Nutcracker is a lot more elaborate and flowery, as well as being slightly toned down. As far as the difference between the two writing styles, here's an example of what I'm talking about, as far as the original being a lot more straightforward and to the point, and the retelling being a little bit wordier and more elaborate. This comes from the Nutcracker's backstory and is one of the things that led up to his feud with the Mouse King. In both versions, there is a king and queen of an unnamed kingdom, and the king asks the queen to make sausage for him. However, as she's going about doing that, the Mouse Queen and her family devour so much of the meat that not enough of it is left to make good sausage. This is how that begins in The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. Now the king spoke very amiably to the queen. "You know, my darling, how much I love sausages." The queen knew what the king was driving at. He meant simply that she ought to submit to the very useful business of making sausages as she herself had done in the past. And this is from the story of the Nutcracker. "Good darling, you haven't forgotten, have you, how much I love blood pudding? You haven't forgotten, have you?" At the king's very first words, she caught her husband's drift. Indeed, with those insidious words, His Majesty quite simply meant that she was to devote herself, as she had so often done, to a very useful occupation. Her royal hands were to prepare the greatest number possible of sausages, chitterlings, and blood sausages. The queen therefore smiled at her husband's declaration, for while very honorably exercising the profession of queen, she was less sensitive to compliments about her dignity in holding the crown and the scepter than about her skill in making a pudding or a baba. She therefore contented herself with gracefully curtsying to her husband, while telling him that she was his servant in regard to a blood sausage and to everything else. You see what I mean? Like, it's the same basic idea. The king asks the queen to make sausage and the queen says, "Okay, of course I will." But the way that it's presented and the level of detail that the author goes into as far as the queen's mindset is very different. I also felt like the child protagonist, Marie, not Clara, was a little bit different between the two versions. In both, she's about the same age, 7 years old, and she's very quiet and nurturing and sensitive and generally a good-natured, obedient little girl. However, I felt like the version in Hoffmann's story was a little bit more believable, and the version in Dumas's story was, I don't know, just too overly sweet and perfect. For example, at the beginning of both stories, they both mention that they want a new doll for Christmas, and that they've let their mothers know this by basically talking about how their old doll has become so clumsy that it's been damaged. However, the ways in which that is said are a little bit different. This is from The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. Now the children debated what their parents would bring them. Marie felt that Fräulein Trudchen, her large doll, was changing deeply, for, clumsier than ever, she fell on the floor every moment. This didn't happen without a nasty grin, and there was no further thought of the cleanliness of her garments, nor did a thorough scolding help. And then this is from the story of the Nutcracker. "Come on," said Marie brightly in order to keep Fritz from talking back to the poor governess. "Come on, let's talk about what our parents will give us. On condition that she won't scold her, I confided in Mamma about my doll, Mademoiselle Rose. I explained that she was growing clumsier and clumsier, despite my endless sermons. Her sole occupation was to tumble on her nose, an accident that always left highly distasteful marks on her features. Since her face now clashed with her frocks, there was no possibility of taking her out into the world." So in both versions, the girl obviously has a very vivid imagination and is imagining that her doll is clumsy or falling on purpose, rather than just damaged because it's old. So the version in The Nutcracker and the Mouse King wants a new doll because hers has been damaged, and is imagining that maybe that's kind of the doll's fault. Okay, I can go with that. But then, in the story of The Nutcracker, Marie is not only worried that her doll has become clumsy, but she's worried about her mother scolding the doll. Whereas in The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, Marie was the one scolding the doll. And she only brings up the question of what they're getting for Christmas at all in order to stop her brother from talking back to their governess. I don't know, she just seems a little too perfect to be believable to me. Additionally, because it takes place in Germany, some of the things that are just kind of assumed that the audience would be familiar with in Hoffman's version are explained in more detail in Dumas's version. And some of it might be a little bit surprising to an American reader. Like, for instance, the fact that they opened presents on the 24th rather than the 25th, that the Christmas tree was put on a table rather than on the floor, and that the gifts were said to come not from Santa Claus but from baby Jesus. Although in both versions it's very evident that the kids understand it's their parents doing it. Despite their differences, both stories have the same main plot, and that plot is very weird. Now, I usually have a pretty high tolerance for suspension of disbelief in fiction. I read a lot of fantasy and science fiction, and so that requires you to just accept things that you know can't possibly work, in the real world. But this pushed it a little bit too far for me. I don't know if it was just that I'm not a child anymore and this is clearly meant for children, or whether it was just that much weirder than the stuff that I did read when I was a child, because I wasn't into, the Alice in Wonderland type stuff either, the stuff where, it doesn't make any sense. I like fantasy where the magic system, or whatever the supernatural aspect of it is, follows certain rules and you can kind of understand how it works, even though it's not possible. This was more like just lots of stuff thrown in out of nowhere that you're like, hang on, that doesn't work that way, with no real explanation or internal consistency. So that takes us to the question of the short stories versus the ballet and how those are different. I already mentioned that the main character's name is Marie rather than Clara. And I also want to emphasize again, she's 7 years old in the short stories, whereas in the ballet, it all depends what age the ballerina that they cast is, but usually in performances of it that I've seen, she's a little bit older than that. When I think of the Nutcracker, I tend to imagine her as either a preteen or a young teenager, not a small child. The 7 years old thing is a problem too, because at the end, she gets married, in both versions. This is from the Nutcracker and the Mouse King. But no sooner was young Drosselmeyer alone with Marie than he knelt down on one knee and said, "Oh, my highly esteemed Demoiselle Stahlbaum, see at your feet your happy Drosselmeyer whose life you saved on this very spot. You were kind enough to state that if I grew ugly for your sake, you would not scorn me like that wretched Princess Pirlipat. I promptly stopped being a despicable Nutcracker, and I regained my earlier not unpleasant looks. Oh, highly esteemed Demoiselle, delight me with your worthy hand. Share the crown and kingdom with me, rule from Marzipan Castle with me, for I am now king there." Marie lifted up the youth and said quietly, "Dear Herr Drosselmeyer, you are a kind and gentle person, and since you also rule a graceful land with very cheerful and attractive people, I will accept you as my fiancée." Marie hereby became Drosselmeyer's fiancée. A year later, we are told, he called for her in a golden carriage drawn by silver horses. And then it goes on to say that she is still the queen of the kingdom of the dolls. Here's the version from the Tale of the Nutcracker. "Oh, my excellent Fräulein Silberhaus, you see at your feet the happy Drosselmeyer whose life you saved in this same place. Furthermore, you've been good enough to tell me that you wouldn't reject me like the ugly Princess Pirlipat, if, to serve you, I had turned hideous. Now the spell cast on me by the Mouse Queen would lose its total impact on the day that, despite my ugly face, I were loved by a young and pretty girl. At that very moment I would stop being a stupid Nutcracker and would revert to my original form, which is not disagreeable, as you can see. So, my dear Fräulein, if you still feel the same way about me, please do me the honor of giving me your beloved hand, sharing my throne and my crown, and reigning with me over the kingdom of the dolls, for I have now become its king again." Marie gently helped young Drosselmeyer to stand up, and she said to him, "You are a good and friendly ruler, your majesty, and you have a charming kingdom adorned with magnificent palaces and inhabited by cheerful subjects. I therefore accept you as my fiancée, provided my parents have no objection." The salon door opened very softly. but the young people paid it no heed, for they were too engrossed in their own feelings. Mother and father and godfather came forward, shouting "Bravo!" with all their strength. Marie was as red as a cherry, while the young man was unfazed. He went over to her parents, and with a graceful bow he paid them a lovely compliment. He then asked for Marie's hand, and it was granted to him on the spot. That same day Marie was engaged to young Drosselmeyer on the condition that the wedding was to take place in a year. So let me reiterate, she is 7, probably 8 by the time that 1 year has passed and they're getting married, but 8. She is 8 years old. What the hell was wrong with these authors? I mean, so it's implied that the Nutcracker turned into a boy around her age, but still, 8 years old. No, absolutely not. Both versions were described by their authors as fairy tales, and in fairy tales, they're often coming-of-age stories where the main characters are described as young girls at the beginning and become married women by the end. But that's usually like Sleeping Beauty, for instance, where she's 16, and so she would have been seen as being kind of on the cusp of adulthood by the society of the time. Or like Snow White and Rose Red, where their ages aren't mentioned at all, and so one can assume that either a lot of time passed or they were also in their late teens. There was a lot that I wasn't a fan of in these stories, but Marie getting married at the end was definitely the worst. Okay, moving on. One of the big differences between the ballet and the short stories is that the short stories involve an extensive backstory that's not really explored at all in the ballet. One can assume that there is probably a reason that the Nutcracker is a Nutcracker and that the Mouse King hates him so much, but it's not really gone into in any amount of detail. On the other hand, in the short stories, it takes up a big part of the story. It's presented as a story that Drosselmeyer is telling to his godchildren, and which everybody else just assumes to be a made-up story that he came up with to entertain them, but which Marie takes to be the truth. It's left very ambiguous for a while as to whether it is the truth or whether she just has an overactive imagination, but the endings of both stories imply that it was true. One thing that really didn't make sense to me was that the Nutcracker was meant to be both Drosselmeyer's nephew and the Prince of the Kingdom of the Dolls. And that really didn't make sense to me because the Drosselmeyers were not implied to be like doll royalty or whatever. And the Nutcracker was only a doll because he was put under a curse. But it's also, I mean, you could take it to mean that he became king somehow or prince or whatever. But then the doll princesses greet him as their brother. Where did they come from? How is he related to them? Are they related to Drosselmeyer too? If not, how on earth does that work? Yeah, there was a lot that didn't make sense. My favorite part of the ballet by far is definitely the journey through the Enchanted Kingdom after the Mouse King is defeated, with the Sugar Plum Fairy and the Waltz of the Flowers and all of that stuff. So I was pretty disappointed to find out that that makes up only a very short portion of the story. It's really not as big of a deal as it's made out to be in the ballet. And there is no Sugar Plum Fairy, so I have to assume that that role was just added so that the prima ballerina of the company would have something interesting and memorable to do. Generally, I'm somebody who rarely prefers an adaptation over the original material, especially when that was a book. But in this case, I have to say that I do. I definitely prefer the ballet over either the Nutcracker and the Mouse King or the Tale of the Nutcracker. I didn't particularly enjoy either one of them very much, although I preferred the Nutcracker and the Mouse King, the version by E.T.A. Hoffman, over the Tale of the Nutcracker by Alexander Dumas. However, as a whole, they were just too weird for me. The backstory was too convoluted, and I didn't quite understand what was going on, and I didn't like the ending at all, but, you know, I mean, you can't like everything that you read. And I do feel like it was interesting to see where the classical story that I'm familiar with came from, so I don't regret reading them. I just probably won't do so again. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this. If you liked this and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays.